All right. So we were looking at the pre-Columbian American architecture, and we looked at the development of the built environment primarily during the first millennium CE. And during the first half of the second millennium CE, pre-Columbian Americas also started empire building. And then, around 1500, the contact with European powers started, and that would belong to the post-Columbian history of the Americas. And so which is a totally different story. So the second half of this lecture, we are going to look at two pre-Columbian American empires. In Central America, it is the Aztec Empire, and the capital city is called Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan is present-day Mexico City. So the current Mexico City was built directly on top of the Aztec city of Tenochtitlan. So we don't know much about it, except for some manuscripts created by the conquerors, the explorers, and some of the manuscript left by the First Nations, the Aztec people themselves. But we do know the current center of Mexico City used to be the ceremonial center of Tenochtitlan. According to Aztec myth, the site of Tenochtitlan was chosen by an eagle resting on a cactus tree on an island in the middle of a lake. So the current Mexico City used to be a lake, and in the center there is an island. So this drawing, drawn by Cortez, the conqueror, the Spaniard who conquered the Aztec Empire, made a drawing. So the drawing is probably a little bit idealized. So the lake is quite regular, a circle, and the center is almost a perfect square, right? So a circle and square, that looks familiar. And for a map of a city, it looks suspicious. So there must be a lot of idealization. And Cortez was living during the Renaissance period. And we know that for Renaissance, ideal circle and square was the perfect geometry. So there is probably a lot of idealization in drawing up this lake, drawing up this map for the city of Tenochtitlan. And such a map probably also inspired the imagination of the utopian city. So simultaneously in Europe, there were a lot of design for ideal city, and there were also kind of imagined land of utopia where people live happily and no one, and equally, happily and equally, no one is very poor, everyone share everything. There's no personal belonging, and that utopian idea probably was also triggered by the contact with the new kind of continent and that inspired all kind of imagination. So the discovery of the New World, the idealization of the New World in terms of a society that is very different from the highly hierarchical society in Europe, and the appearance of the utopia in the European imagination. These phenomena during the Renaissance period is probably not coincident. They might be mutually inspiring each other. So we really don't know much about Tenochtitlan as a city, but today, in the central square of Mexico City, the Spanish people built a cathedral, and there is a square in front of it. So that was originally the location of the island. And the lake, after the conquest, was filled, and a European style city was constructed on top of the marshland, the paved marshland. So this is the plan of the Panama City in the 17th century, which is pretty much reflect the fashion of development, colonial development of Mexico City a century before. You know, in the 16th century, the new Mexico City was probably very similar to this, with a square in the center and important religious and civic building constructed around it, and with street and avenues constructed in the European fashion, and with city walls that reflect those military characteristic of the medieval city. But this is the current center of Mexico City. The cathedral was constructed there. Some archaeological work has done, and they did discover pyramid, you know, the base of pyramid under this square and under the site of this central area. So Cortez's map is probably quite accurate in terms of the, you know, the depiction of those pyramids. So he depicted pyramids in that in the center of the central island. And bridges were created to connect the central island with the surrounding areas. So, you know, other than that, we really don't know very much about Tenochtitlan as the capital of the Aztec, other than, you know, what is shown in Cortez's map and what is confirmed by archaeological discovery in the central area of today's Mexico City. The conquest, of course, was with a lot of intrigues and war. But since the 16th century, the face of Americas start to change. Colonial powers, immigrants from Europe, from all over the world start to dominate the new world, and that belonged to the history of this country as well as other countries in the two Americas. So in South America, the great empire is known as the Inca Empire. So the Inca Empire concentrated on the west coast of South America, primarily in today's Peru, Chile, and part of Argentina, and part of Colombia, and part of Brazil, in this area along the coast. The administration center is in today's Republic of Peru, and in the Cusco Valley. The city of Cusco is located at the border of the 4 major provinces. So there are 4 major provinces, and the vast land of the to the east, including the Amazon. So those 4 provinces, the meeting spot is in the Cusco Valley. So it served as the capital city for the Inca Empire. Like any other empires, the Inca Empire also built tens of thousands of miles of road, and some of those road today is still the key passage in the rugged Andes mountain. Like this one was left by the Inca. And as I mentioned before, the Americas did not have contact with the old world since 10,000 BCE until 500 years ago. So its civilization was developed independently, and they didn't have wheel, they didn't have chariot, they didn't have horse. So all those message spreading rely on the foot runner. So foot runner send message, and so it must take weeks for message to spread from the capital to the provinces, and even month. But in the ancient world, that was fast enough for the empire to get connected, right? Some of those roads are still being used. And so they didn't have horses, but they do have llama, right? Llama was not for riding, but was capable of carrying some load. So it's an entirely different, economic system, totally different food crops, totally different domesticated animals, and totally different numerical system, and totally different civilization. The city of Cusco, serving as the imperial city, was designed in the shape of a puma, the sacred animal representing the divine power of the ruler. So landscape was shaped to represent this animal. The castle, elevated on a hill, was shaped into the head of the animal, and the 2 rivers were redirected to form the tail of the puma. And different part of the animal in the city design are symbolic in terms of their location and in terms of their functionality in civic life. So the head was the palace and religious center for the whole city. And the belly, which was a square, forms the main ceremonial square for the city, and covered with pure sand brought from the seashore, which was pretty far away from this location. So we have the ceremonial center, we have the administration and the palatial and religious center, and then the rest of the city was divided into different blocks, divided by streets. The puma represent the power of the Inca king, who dressed for battle in puma skin and dressing as the royal clan's animal totem. So here we have a detailed site plan for the head of the puma. It was kind of the nature was shaped pretty in detail to resemble the head of an animal. And the slope of the hill was buttressed by the zigzagging walls, and which kind of blurred the man-made construction with the natural environment. After the Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire, the immigrants, European immigrants, destroyed the city and constructed European-style house directly on top of the Inca wall. So today, you can still see a clear-cut division between the pre-Columbian Inca construction and the European-style house, right? So these are the European construction, and they were built on the foundation of pre-Columbian walls. So here in this small alley as well, European-style architecture constructed on top of the pre-Columbian base. The masonry work for the pre-Columbian Inca builders was very sophisticated. For example, each individual stone is carefully dovetailed to form a mortarless, earthquake-proof wall. So unlike the Romans, they did not create standardized size of blocks and then simply pile them up. Rather, each individual block was custom made, and sometimes they were created to make such a close combination with neighboring stones. And some of them served almost like mortise and tenon joined to fix those stones together. So those stones are not shifting horizontally during earthquake because they were kind of biting with one another. So here as well, look at that piece of stone, how it is shaped to make a close combination, make a close integration with the neighboring stones. So a lot of air-shaped stone to create an interlocking structure of masonry work. We have only seen such a fashion of wall building in ancient Egyptian from the Old Kingdom in the construction of the Valley Temple for the funeral complex of Khafre in Giza, the Great Pyramid, and their accompanying temples were constructed, some parts were constructed in this fashion, creating those kind of strong walls. But not much other places. Even the Greeks, who had a kind of sculptural approach to architecture, didn't make such kind of a full integration of stone blocks. They use metal pin to prevent horizontal shifting. Not this sophisticated in terms of the reshaping of the natural material of stone. And the surfaces were also smooth and also curved, forming those kind of curved surfaces, and which of course is more time consuming. The stones were lowered from above with ropes tied to knobs and polished until the interlock with adjacent stones. And some of those knobs were still left there, and those were the place where the ropes were tied to the stone to lower them from above to make those perfect fixture. And such a sophisticated construction was used exclusively for religious and royal structures. So this is, of course, not for the commoners. Commoners would use much more simplistic fashion of construction if they use stone, and their houses are primarily constructed in wood and a thatched roof. So these are high standard, belonging to those who can command a lot of labors. So here we are looking at the head of the puma, and of course the rest of the city are entirely, after colonial reconstruction. So it's almost entirely colonial in style, combining those European style architecture with some pre-Columbian foundation. The fortress above the city, that the head, known as Sacsayhuaman, was believed to be at the precinct devoted to the sun worship. So the religious practice in the imperial headquarters is primarily making sacrifice to the sun, and the zigzagging retaining wall, creating those different levels to consolidate the the fortress, formed a kind of a seamless merging with the surrounding environment, and even the shape and the shadow kind of resemble the natural landscape, the mountain range behind it. So, which makes the pre-Columbian American architecture looks almost like a reshaping of the landscape, and kind of existing harmoniously with the surrounding landscape. So building seems to be kind of growing out of the mountain. So here it seems even more clearly those retaining walls and the landscape in the background. In the similar fashion, we have seen in the Mayan and Mesoamerican architecture from the first millennium CE, the resemblance between the pyramid and the kind of volcanic mountain peaks in the background create a kind of a similar resemblance like this. So this kind of a geometric and the the interplay between the geometric and organic is typical to Incan architecture and to pre-Columbian American architecture in general. Pre-Columbian Americas were great agriculturalists. So they reshaped the rugged landscape into terraced farmland. And so those terraces is arable. So they can plant. The reshaping of the landscape itself represent the power because of the requirement for enormous labors for such activities. So the sculpting of nature and extending human construction to embrace nature, to seamlessly blend into nature is a representation of power. And for such terraced farmland, water canals was needed as well. And they also developed very sophisticated way of modifying the soil composition to allow the growth of maize in those high altitude. So this kind of a reshaping and remaking soil for agriculture was not unique to the Inca. The Aztec people also did that. For example, in the city of Tenochtitlan, which is today's Mexico City, they developed those farmland on the surface of water. They put, they put those, the maize stalks and to float on the surface of the lake, and then create a layer of soil on top of it. And in those soil, they can plant plant crops they need. So the pre-Columbian American people were great agriculturalists, and they developed a very sophisticated way to manipulate the soil for food productivity. Now let's take a look at the famous, landmark, the great, architectural heritage of Machu Picchu in Peru. So this site was completed, and being in use until the Spanish conquest. So it was probably completed and occupied around 1450, and in the early 16th century. So Machu Picchu is located at a 3-day travel distance from Cuzco, right? So those distance, the time spent on traveling those distance was measured by a normal runner. So you run that distance, and there were stops in those roads. So one messenger travel for a day and rest in those stops, and then another runner would pick up that message and continue to run if they are messengers. So those distances were measured that way. So Machu Picchu is located in a 3-day travel distance from the capital city, at a defensible location above a strategic river. It was not conquered by the Spanish conquistador. Rather, it was later discovered by Hiram Bingham in 1911. When he discovered it, he noticed that it had been abandoned a long time ago. But in historical record, this site was unknown to the Spanish people. It was hidden in the mountain, so it was not conquered. Unlike Cusco, it was not conquered. So there was no new building, no European building built on top of it. So it was preserved pretty much in the 100% pre-Columbian situation. And Bingham thought it was the lost city of the sun in the Incan legend, a citadel to which the Incan ruler retreated to organize resistance to the Spanish invasion. So he interpreted that way. Whether it is true or not is not confirmed by any, either written document or archaeological proof. It was a hypothesis brought up by the explorer Bingham. But in general, archaeologists agree that the complex was a royal estate. It was not a city in the normal sense where you have commoners, common citizens who reside in this city. In another word, Machu Picchu, according to the mainstream archaeologists, is exclusively for the king. And whoever lived there, stayed there, were the officials or the servants serving the king, taking care of the estate, in addition to the immediate family member of the king. So it is not a city in the normal sense where everyone can move here and become a citizen. So it was primarily used for retreat and for religious and court activity. So in this sense, Bingham's hypothesis for such a place, hidden from the outside world, to be a place to kind of organize resistance to the conquerors was not entirely baseless. So you can see it is very defensible. Most of the sites are, direct drop into those valleys. It's not easy to climb up from those sides. The only approachable side is open only to one direction, and which make it very easy to defend and very hard for someone to discover. Located in the center is an open space. So, I hesitate to call it a square. Well, it is a terrace. It is terraced, right? It is not just a flat square. So marked by this green area, that's the center of the complex. The religious district is located to the north, indicated by this kind of light blue area. And the royal residence on the west. So here we have the royal buildings, houses for retainers on the south, and then natural rock outcrops to the east. There was a high peak right there, like a tower located to the east. And to the north, to the east, and to the southwest area, those are kind of pretty much directly neighboring the deep valley. The access to the site was from the northwestern area, from that area, where you find the terraced landscape, which allow one to step up to the central area. And then the hill continue to rise on the southeastern direction. And in a sense, it is also protected because other people need to mount a distant mountain and then have a downward looking at the site. So that part is also pretty hard to attack. So that is the only kind of a accessible direction. So the landscape were kind of constructed, were reshaped. You know, there's again the interplay between the organic and the geometric. The landscape were reshaped into terraces, and those terraces were developed into farmlands, which could cultivate crops to supply food. So if they have a retreat here, they didn't need to rely on the outside supply to provide food. So they could be produced right on the site. And there, the architecture and the nature really blend into one another. So we are looking from that high direction, looking down, and looking at those reshaped, accessible terrace on the other direction. Incan engineers developed expertise of artificially reconstructing and enriching the soil using fertilizer, as I mentioned before, and the selection of crops and terraces to control soil erosion and increase the fertility of an otherwise inhospitable environment. So those were totally reclaimed from the mountain, those farmland. They also channeled a spring half a mile away into the compound to create a series of 16 ritual fountains. And the first fountain is located inside the royal suite, supplying the king with the purest water to perform the ritual and purification bath. So they have a quite sophisticated water system, and those water system for drinking, for ceremony, and those were separate from the waste. So here I'm showing you those pictures showing the directing of those spring water for good use, ritual or drinking. The residential architecture combined masonry supporting wall, load-bearing wall, with timbered roof. So there are 150 residences grouped in 14 gated complexes. Each one is unique. It's expressing the social status of elite king group. And the origin of these palatial architecture was from the common peasant building known as mesma, Massima courtyard house like this, made of adobe bricks and with one side open to the courtyard. And in the royal architecture, those adobe were replaced by high quality stone, and the roof was probably still thatched, but probably supported by better wood. And in this case, you don't need a central ridge because the central wall were also constructed with stone. And it is in much higher quality than those commoners' small houses. The royal residence on the other side, those residents directly for the king, located, the closest to the water, and the main entrance is facing a side wall to create some privacy. And the stonework, not as sophisticated as Cusco, but still the stone are high quality and very heavy and very thick as well. So here we have the kind of characteristic Incan trapezoidal shape for the gate, as well as for the niches in the wall, which is very typical to Inca architecture. The tapering of the wall is, of course, structurally sound. It also reduces the spanning for the lintel, which is a large piece of stone. So the stone, which is not very good at being used in this kind of wooden fashion, the narrowing down of the span helped to create stability. And in the imagery, that trapezoidal shape also have a visual effect of being more stable. The social hierarchy in architecture is registered in the thickness and weight of the lintel. Those royal complex had twice as heavy lintels as the lesser aristocratic residence, those returners at Machu Picchu. And those vertical kind of niches in the wall was probably used for holding lamps to illuminate the interior. And because there's no statue or effigy discovered here, so probably it's for more practical function instead of religious ones. So reshaping of nature can be observed everywhere. Again, the integration between organic and the geometric. So here I'm showing two examples. One is called the Intihuatana stone, which is this one, which literally means the hitching post of the sun. The sun is imagined as orbiting the earth, but tied to the sacred site by some kind of a, pulling force, pulling connection, as if like a rope that can be tied to this location. It is reshaped out of the mountain It is, a whole top of the mountain was removed to create this flat land, and the central part was left there and shaped into this very complicated, looks almost like an abstract sculpture, like those sculpture by Henry Moore. So in total, there are as many as 20 buildings devoted to ritual functions, as well as unique open-air altars, for which the Intihuatana is just one of them. Here is another example where the mountain boulders were reshaped into a screen, serving probably as a backdrop for sacrificial function. So here we have a platform, probably served as sacrificial bed. And here we have Bingham standing there, posing in front of that reshaped nature. So standing in front of an environment like this, one, can't help wondering about where architecture stopped and where nature started, and vice versa. So architecture is directly reshaped out of those natural environment, and their shape were created to respond like an echo to the surrounding natural environment. So here, built environment and the natural environment kind of continued seamlessly, blending into one another. So this is another example of those reshaping of nature to form architecture. This is known as the Temple of the Sun. The temple has the elliptical shape of a rainbow on one side and a straight line on the other side. So rainbow is also a major deities of the Inca, considered as the messenger, communicator with the sun. So here, sun worship, sacrifice to sun, and also all those, gods and goddesses that was crucial for, the interaction with the solar divinity. There are many kind of trapezoidal niches in the wall, but one of them is an open window. And that open window was oriented toward the summer solstice. So during the summer solstice, the sunshine passed through that window and shed upon the rock outcrops enclosed by the wall. So it must hold significant religious and ritual function for their sacrifice. So again, here it reminds us a lot of prehistoric Neolithic monuments in the old world, where architectural orientation toward winter solstice, summer solstice, or spring and autumn equinox was crucial. And here, as late as 500 years ago, this is still a key concern for the orientation of architecture, and that, which certainly make the this temple part of a giant kind of clock to give definition to the passing of time. So this is the old window looked from outside. So it is certainly a specially designed part of this building. And this building was created in the same fashion as those royal structures in the capital city of Cusco. Stones were custom made, and they were shaped into organic surfaces to have a more integrated combination with neighboring stones and with nature. And those stones were individually fitted into the bedrock, which blurred the distinction between nature and culture. So here you see this masonry wall seems kind of emerging from the natural outcrops seamlessly, and that the boundary between architecture and nature is blurred. And under the temple is a royal tomb. So there is a cavity there, and which is part of a reshaping of a natural cave in the rock, and that cavity was further sculpted to create an interior space to serve as the royal tomb. Again, here from the interior, or the half interior, just under the temple, which is built on top of the outcrops, shows the subtle sculpting of the natural landscape and adjustment of the man-made structure using complex organic geometry. That steps was created by reshaping that rock. And those stones were created to fit into those space of those natural outcrops in the site. So again, to re-emphasize that point, the Inca power and harmony, that sense of power and harmony, intentionally blurring the boundaries between nature and culture, architecture and the landscape, creating a harmonious kind of blending. Thus, the pre-Columbian built environment are formed in the concept of in the reshaping of natural landscape.